Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Anna Allred, and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar will be on November 10th. Watch out for the 6 Dangerous DNA Myths Part 2 with James Baker. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner, researching the Great Northward Migration 1916 to 1970, the movement of 6 million African Americans. James has over 39 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy, Star, Blog, and Rejoice and Be Exceeding Glad. He has served as family history volunteer for 17 years and has presented at expos and conferences around the US, Canada, and Europe. He is a member of the Board of Directors of the Family History Guide Association and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. James is a professional photographer and has 7 children, 34 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. And James, if you're ready, we can turn the time over to you now.
Okay, here we go. Choose the right one and get it going. Okay. Well, this is a topic that is quite different than many of the things we've talked about on the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We have, I don't think we've ever mentioned this, and it's interesting because this is one of the most dramatic movements of people within the United States that has ever occurred. And it is usually not, in fact, it's almost totally ignored by historians. So it's an interesting phenomena, and it may help to explain many, let's say, difficult family history issues. Although I'm going to focus on the Black migration. There was a very great white migration out of the South at the same time. So bearing in mind that not all the factors that occurred were solely based on the Black population, but from the standpoint of the African Americans involved, this was a major relocation throughout the country. So kind of to explain how this might become confusing is that there were 2 great migrations as in history that the term is used for 2 different time periods. The first is from Britain to America from 1620 to 1640. And that's called the Great Migration. And then there's another great migration from the southern states to the northern states, which began in 1880 and lasted until about 1970. So there were just a few people at first, and most of the major movements happened over the period of time from around during and after World War I, and then after World War II. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. If you're interested at all in finding out what happened in the real American history that you will probably never learn about in your American history classes in school, I suggest a good place to start is with this book called The Warmth of Other Suns. And it is the story of the epic story of Americans' Great Migration. And I just have a quote here. The story of the Great Migration is among the most dramatic and compelling in all chapters of American history. So far-reaching are its effects even now that we scarcely understand its meaning. this is something that is in the news right today. And if it's hard for people to understand the depth of the effects that will be felt for the rest of the existence of the United States as a country, and it will affect nearly every person in the country, whether they understand this or not, and it will become one of the most important factors in American history that ever happened, even more than any of the world wars or any of the other items that occurred throughout the migrations. Now, from my own particular standpoint, some of the same types of things happened with my own ancestors who left the United States of America to go to Mexico in order to avoid persecution. And so I have a little bit of, because of that fact alone, have more interest in what happened here than perhaps other people would who do not have an ancestral history that is not nearly as bad. We're not the same kind of conditions or anything near to be the same kinds of conditions, but some of the same motivations were resident among those people who had to move because of persecution and because of longstanding mistreatment. This book is worth reading, and I would strongly recommend it as a way to begin to understand what was really happening in America during the time that I was growing up and that many of the older people in our country were growing up. So start your discovery of the Great Migration with this book, The Warmth of Other Suns. The Great Migration was the relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South to cities of the North, Midwest, and West. And most of it began in 1880, but most of the movement was after or during World War I, from 1916 up through 1970. Now, these two maps show the percentage of the US population by state in 1900 that were Black, and the percentage of the people in the United States that were Black after in 1990. So from 1900 to 1990, so 1900 on the left and 1990 on the right, and you can see that there was a tremendous change in the demographics of the United States over that time period. The South became less populated with the African American people, and other states that previously maybe had no population or a very small population became extremely got appreciable percentages of African Americans as part of their state. For instance, if you focus on California, you'll see that there was a pretty dramatic change from 1900 to 1990. Well, the causes of the Great Migration are still debated. There's a lot of different causes that have been attributed to the reasons. And what needs to be understood is that this was not in the sense of when I referenced the Mormon pioneer movement from the east to the west. That was an organized group of people who had one unified religion and purpose in their movement. In the South, this was a movement of individuals making individual decisions on an individual or family basis in small family groups or just as individuals to leave and to get out of the oppression that had been occurring since they had arrived in the country as enslaved people, some of them dating back hundreds of years. The main reasons were economic exploitation. Those people who were living in the South and who were African American or Black people in the South were simply not, had never escaped from the effects of enslavement. Despite the Civil War and the 14th Amendment and all of the different laws that were passed and attempts that were made to overcome the prejudice and overcome the situations that the formerly enslaved people found themselves in, they were still being treated as slaves. They were still even more ostracized from their society than they had been previously. And there was a series of laws that were passed in the South called the Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws were, when you read about these laws and you have not participated, or if you've not lived in the South, and even if you were a white person in the South, you may not even have been aware of the laws because they existed the way they did. But that's hard to believe, but it's not, it's probably impossible. But they were so limiting that people could not, for example, people could not sit on the same, in some places were not allowed to sit in the same trolley cars with Blacks and whites. People were not, was not just a matter of separate restroom areas or a separate drinking fountains. It was so pervasive that there was almost no part of the Black lives that were not affected. And they were not only treated as if they were still slaves by those people who were employing them, but they were paid in some cases nothing for their work, other than being supplied with a few meager belongings. And so it was also enforced by a systematic system of social terror. We'll see some statistics on that in a second. The social terror was that if any Black person dared to step outside of the rules that were being enforced against them, as far as even communicating with white people or expressing an opinion or failing to give deference to a white person, they could be instantly thrown into prison, and worse than that, they could be killed and beaten and any other thing with impunity. There were virtually no convictions for the killings of Black people during this entire Jim Crow period from the 1800s well into the 1900s, into the 1950s and 60s. Some of us became only aware of this. Of course, I was not old enough to know a lot about it, but I became aware of it most when I was living in Phoenix, Arizona. And now Phoenix was not exactly the center of any of the riots or racial disturbances that occurred during the civil rights movement, but there was some of that, and some of that was very, very evident to us as we lived and as I worked in downtown Phoenix. It was very evident that there was a lot of, and that was when I began to become aware that there was a serious problem. I lived in a very white-oriented society, and actually was raised in a segregated community, which I didn't even know was segregated until many years after I left. And that was a small town in eastern Arizona where the segregation was between the Spanish-speaking community and the English-speaking community. If you spoke English, you went to one school. If you spoke Spanish or had spoken Spanish, you went to a different school. And we never talked and we never interacted with any of the Spanish-speaking community at the level of that when I was a child. And so this was something that I was not really aware of. And it took until later that I became aware of that situation. Between 1880 and 1950, an African American was lynched more than once a week for some perceived breach of the racial hierarchy. These are, and I have the citations here to this. So you're looking at least 52 people a year from 1880 to 1950 who were killed for minor, unimportant reasons. It was just a matter of terrorism. It was a matter of trying to keep the Black population from asserting any kind of involvement with the white congregation. Some people have, and some of the writers have attributed the exodus of the Black community from the southern part of the United States due to what they call the Bull Weevil infestation. This is the Bull Weevil. And interestingly enough, when I was in grade school, we used to sing songs in our classes. I don't know if they do that. I doubt they do that much anymore, but we used to have singing time, and we would go into the cafeteria, which was also the stage area in our grade school, and they'd have us sing some songs. And one of them was about the Bull Weevil in the South. I doubt if there was any of us that had any concept of what a Bull Weevil was, and had no idea, even though we were living in Phoenix, Arizona, which was one of the major cotton growing areas of the United States. There's just no connection here. You find out that in your life as you go along and learn history, and this applies dramatically to genealogy, because so many people, when they become involved in doing research with their families, fail to look at or even be aware of any of the historical things that were going on, any of the forces that were involved in their ancestors' immigration, or in the way they lived, or how many children died in their youth, or all of the other factors that are very much apparent from a historical in a historical context are things that genealogists, by and large, tunnel themselves down the tunnel of filling out family group sheets and pedigree charts, and begin ignoring the greater historical background of what happened. When they get to the end of a line and they have what's called a brick wall, then and occasionally they begin to have to come to grips with the idea that their people were embedded in history, and that there was no difference, that you need to know that the difference between genealogy and history, that genealogy is history. And if we don't know the history, we really can't understand the genealogy. Well, these little bugs, well, they're not quite so little, but they're smallish type bugs, were a devastation to the cotton fields in the South. And the primary way that the Black population was being used in the South was to pick cotton and to maintain the cotton plants and hoe the cotton and do all of the heavy work that's been now primarily done by machine and by spraying for weeds and spraying for pests and all sorts of things that we do today with cotton fields. I'm very familiar with cotton fields. I've chopped cotton. I have gone down the rows and chopped out the weeds on the mile-long rows, and I have spent my time in the cotton fields. And so I can very well attest to how difficult the work was. I have never picked cotton because by the time I was at the age that I was being used to hoe cotton, it was there was more mechanical harvesting of cotton than there was early on. So from about 1909 to the mid 1920s, there was a vast reduction in the demand for Black farm workers. And so there was nothing for them to do, and there was little ways for them to live. And there was a great incentive to leave the South and move north. And to be able to track these people would be very difficult because, first of all, the records were not consistently kept for enslaved people. And secondly, there was no notice of them leaving or where they were going or when they were going to do. If someone managed to learn, if one of the white people managed to learn that the Blacks were leaving, they were passing laws against them leaving and actually forcing them to stay and finding people who would come down from the north and inform them about opportunities. The northern people, of course, during a lot of this period of time, except for the Great Depression in the 1930s, during World War I and World War II, there were tremendous labor shortages. And one of the sociological effects of the great labor shortage during World War II was that many women began working and continued working into the present. And even more women are working today than were back then. But in addition, there was a demand for labor in the northern states and in the western states, which was simply overwhelming. And the Black farm workers in the South would hear that they could make 3, 5, 10 times what they were making in the South by simply leaving and going to another state. And they would do that basically to escape being beaten, killed, hanged, and whatever else that was awaiting them if they lived and continued to live in the South. But like I said, the magnitude of the impact of the Bull Weevil itself is a subject to discussion and dispute. It's pretty apparent that even absent the drop in production of the cotton fields, that the Blacks would have left for all of the other reasons that they were motivated to get out of the subjugation that was happening and the terrible laws that were being passed in the South. So this was the main purpose. The jobs were paying much more. There were jobs. There were ways for the people to go north. They could have a place to live. They could make enough money to have clothes and food for their children. And they were more than willing to move into what we were still considered to be very unfavorable conditions, but comparatively would be at least better than what they had previously had, because there was not the same level of discrimination in the northern states and the western states as there was in some other places. Some of my relatives, for example, are Jewish, and Jewish people, excuse me, in the United States were denied, in some cases, were denied rooms in hotels and entry to some businesses. But there's nothing, absolutely nothing compared to the systematic segregation that was happening between the Blacks and the whites in the South, and even over into the northern and western states. There was still places in as far as Arizona where a Black person could not find a hotel to stay in the state because there was no place for them to stay. No one would rent them a room. So it was a difficult time, and it was a difficult journey that they had to make in order to leave the South. So there's really two parts of it, the 1910 to 1930. The reason why it's divided the way it is because during the Great Depression, everyone was out of work from 1930 to approximately 1939, when the war effort began to lessen the impact of the Depression. And since no one could get work, there was no incentive to leave and go someplace else where there was no demand for the labor, and many people were out of work and out of jobs. We haven't ever gone through this kind of a depression here in the United States, and the Great Recession that we had may have put a lot of people out of work. But it did not last anything close to the 10 years between 1930 and 1940. And so what we are experiencing here in the United States, for example, here in Utah, unemployment at the present time is at just over 2% unemployment in the state of Utah. And we can't hardly understand how it would be for people who could not get paid. Now, as we go through this, to make sure that you understand that as you go back and do your research in your family, you'll go through these same areas and these same situations. If your family came from the South, if they were Black or they were white, they were part of that apartheid segregational situation that existed there. And that influenced the way they lived and the way that they treated other people. And it also affected anything that happened in their lives. And the Great Depression, which was a worldwide depression, was something that affected all the people's lives. I have stories during the Depression and during the war that followed. There were shortages of everything, and I have family stories of neighbors putting together enough sugar so they could make a cake for a wedding cake, for example, and things like that. But that's kind of the minor things that were going on. The major things that were going on was homelessness and the level of the quality of life, which was basically destroyed for many people between 1920 and 1930. So the demand for labor in World War I and World War II accelerated the exodus from the South. So you'll see more people living. So let's assume that you're doing research in the South and you find in the North, let me start with the North. It's probably a simpler example. Let's suppose you're doing research and you have a family that lives in Minneapolis, or you have a family that lives in Detroit or Chicago or New York or Boston or any of the larger cities, or Los Angeles or San Francisco or Phoenix, Arizona, for example. And they are living there, and you go back and in 1940 or between 1940 and 1930, this family simply disappears. There's just nothing that you can find of where this family exists. They're no longer on the census records that you can see. They're no longer have any connection that you can see. And one of the possibilities at this time was that these people were part of this exodus out of the South, and that you need to focus on expanding your research to a greater degree throughout the country to try and figure out where they left and where they came. So basically, this is a kind of an idea that underlies a lot of the movements of the population, whether it was because of migration from East Coast to West Coast, whether it was forced migration because of something like the great migration out of the South, where it was an attempt to save their own lives, or whether it was the Dust Bowl or any of the other migrations. But all of those pale in comparison to the numbers of people that are estimated at 6 million people having moved out of the South. Now, the migrants during the first phase of the Great Migration traveled to New York, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Chicago. These were the destinations. It was not pre-planned. It was not something that was being sold to anybody. This was basically a situation where this was where the jobs were. This is where the information was coming from. The early people who left earlier in the time, and they would write back or they would talk to their relatives, and they would tell them that conditions were so much better, and they would come back to the South to visit, and they'd have new clothes, and they'd have a car, and the South, and all that needed to happen and everyone else would want to leave at the same time. So from 1940 to 1970, the migrants moved westward to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Seattle, and Portland. And significant before this time, before 1940, there were simply no significant African-American populations in these states. And after 1940, there are significant African-American populations. So it's a good idea to understand this as you watch people move from place to place. Now, to some extent, we have a tendency in genealogy to characterize the research that needs to be done to find a family and to find an individual by a category. We say, oh, well, that's African-American genealogy, and that's Jewish genealogy, and that's Native American genealogy, and that's Scandinavian genealogy. Well, it's true that in each of those different categories of genealogical research, that there are different records which may be of assistance, that there are some challenges in each area that are slightly different than simply a person who was born in the United States whose ancestors were born in England, for example, or a person who was born in the United States whose ancestors came from Germany. But in every case, as we characterize them as somehow separate, we're doing the same thing in a sense that was done in the South for categorizing the people. Genealogy is genealogy. It doesn't really matter. It's based on records. It's based on location. It's based on the naming and names of people and the naming patterns of people. And the historical research is essentially the same in every country. That the language may be different, some of the customs may be different, but we've got to get down and stop thinking in terms of segregating out different types of genealogical research. It's all genealogy. People can specialize in that. They can say, well, I specialize in finding African-American genealogy. What that means, in essence, is that you have learned to use Southern records and that you're aware of the Great Migration and you're aware of the factors that affected the Black population, which is the same thing you need to know to do any other kind of research. And so it's something that we all need to be aware of, that we take and view genealogy as a sort of a monolithic, looking at the human race. We're all related. Our DNA does not differ by an appreciable percentage between anybody, any place in the world today. And so we should begin to look at ourselves internationally and think of ourselves as being part of a worldwide family from the genealogical standpoint. My recent genealogical results from my heritage showed me exactly that. I have probably got traces of genealogy and on every continent except Antarctica, supposedly. And I have people in different parts of the world, like Africa and Middle Eastern people, and in Southern Europe, that I have no concept of. I have no concept of being related to, but I am quickly becoming educated to the fact that I have a universal kind of genealogy that expands back past the few generations that I have already done in my own research. Okay, so we begin with the same basic rule as one used for immigrants. Your research begins in the place of arrival, not the place of departure. So if you're trying to find the immigrant, this is the rule. The rule is this: that the descendants and the events in the immigrant's life that occurred in the country of arrival are more likely to be recorded, particularly depending on the age of the individual that immigrates. But in this case, with the Great Migration, the research going back in time should start with where the people are found in the north, and then attempt to find information that can connect them to their southern ancestry. Remember to focus on locations as well as names and dates. So you may have to track somebody clear across the country. And this is true of all genealogical research, but particularly true with this kind of a massive movement of people from one area of the country to another, when it's not going to any particular place, but being spread out across a number of large populations and some other smaller cities across the country. So it's a major thing to take into consideration. So the real question is, and the basic question to ask is, where did your ancestors come from before they moved north? How did we just have to, that's what you have to determine. And you would ask the same question of any immigrant: where did their ancestors come from before they arrived in America, or before they came to Pennsylvania, or before they came to New England? But in this case, we have to treat the migration as the same way that we would treat any other research having to do with immigration, and that is try to identify a place location before we start thinking, oh, well, the South, for example, which is a massive amount of a place to start to look. So the first place you might state my focus on is the U.S. federal census records. And the U.S. federal census records are probably the best place to do the research clear back to the 1880 census, and perhaps as early as 1870. And so looking for people in the census records and seeing there where they came from. So in this page, for example, you can see that every person was born, except for a few down in South Carolina, were born in Alabama, and all their parents were born in Alabama, except a few in South Carolina. So we have Alabama and South Carolina in this 1920 census. Alabama is not a very helpful place to start looking, but it's better than having the entire South to look for. Another way to look and to locate the people is to check city directories for businesses and individuals. Many of the African American migrants began their own businesses, and they were listed in the directories for the larger cities. And city directories are becoming more and more available online. Millions and millions of pages of city directories are now available on websites like MyHeritage and on Ancestry. And so this is a good place to begin looking for information of continuity and addresses. And then don't forget the concept of cluster research. So once you have a directory and you identify a person in a city directory or in a census record, it is inevitable that the people around them are going to be related in some way. It would be very unusual if you found a family unit or a person. Many individuals left the South as individuals, but later were followed by their families. So over time, there may be more families, but they were often going to a location where they knew someone previously or that they had relatives in the area. And so these city directories and the census records can become the basis for looking for clusters of people who are living in the same area, who are now somehow related through where they originally came from as friends, or because they're related by bloodlines, or they're related because of work, or some other issue that brought them all to one place in order to live together. One very good thing to look at are the draft registration cards, both for World War I and World War II. Every male in the United States had to be registered for the draft. And so this is, in a sense, a census substitute in around 1916 to 1918, and then up to from around 1939 to 40 up and through the war as they continued different registrations. It wasn't a one-time registration. It was an ongoing process that when the people reached a certain age, they had to register for the draft. I am aware that 18-year-olds today do not have to register for the draft, but when I turned 18 years old, I had to register for the draft. And had I not been given a education excuse, if you will, excused from the draft for education purposes, I would have been drafted into the Army. But the records are there, and they're very valuable records, and they will tell you exactly what a lot of information about the person, and perhaps about where they worked and who their family was that was in the area. And the more research you do in family members, we often focus on our direct line, and we do a lot of research on the direct line ancestors, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and so forth. We omit to do the research on each and every one of the children very frequently, and we also omit to do the research on all of the siblings of all of the people. So as we go back, we should be sure to do the research equally as in depth on all of the children. If we do this, as we move backward, we'll find that we have fewer and fewer dead ends and brick walls to confront, because we will have solved the problem of where the people were born and who they were, and what we need to look for at the next level by looking at all of the family members as a whole. So here's some places that you may not have thought about when you're doing African American research. the Pullman Porter National Historic Registry of the African American Railroad Employees. Many of the African Americans got employment through the railroad system and in other transportation areas. And so this is a labor history museum. And those of you who do not have direct African American ancestors should be aware that there were a lot of other people who worked for the railroads, and that railroad records, although they're not usually considered to be genealogical records and included in the larger genealogical databases, are a valuable source of information for about families. In this case, this is a website to Black Chicago's Hidden Archives, and from the University of Chicago. And I'm giving the URLs here on the website, but just to make you aware that there's an alternative types of websites and information that is being gathered and continues to be gathered about the Black migration. So my suggestion is to learn about the history and the cultural impact of this migration. If this is something new to you, that you have never heard about all these people moving out of the South during this time period, I would once again recommend the book that I did at the beginning of the presentation, that you can begin to learn about the conditions and the laws and the issues and the challenges that these people had, and how they were treated, and why there was such an incentive for them to leave and get out. They had no other options. There was no other options except to leave. Good idea if you're just starting out with any research, but in this particular case, this is very valuable, and that is African American genealogy, as giving some specific records that have been specifically created that are applicable to African Americans. And this is in the Family Search Research Wiki. So if you go to familysearch.org and go to the search tab up there, you'll see the wiki, and just simply look for United States genealogy, and then you'll have a link to African American right there on the page. Another good place to look is in the funeral homes. The records here can give a lot of different information about the individuals. And the African American funeral homes are a good source of those records. And here on the Family Search Wiki, there is an explanation about how those records are obtained. There's another one on the wiki, and that is the African American Digital Bookshelf. And this is a listing of the different digital books that pertain to the African American experience. A good way to find any kind of information about any genealogical subject is to use the Worldcat. It's the worldcat.org, right? It's there on the screen. And it is the catalog of all the catalogs. In other words, all the university library catalogs around not all, but a substantial number. They have over 2 billion catalog entries on the Worldcat to books and publications and information about almost any book in any library. For example, the Brigham Young University Library is entirely on Worldcat, and are many of the other libraries around the United States and around the world. Even local libraries you can find the books on Worldcat. This is a place to go to find books and any other research material that you need. And it's you might find it interesting to put in your surname and some other information and see how many thousands of books there may be out about your particular lines. We have a section in the Family History Guide about African American genealogy with some specific references to various websites where the information and the articles and videos about doing African American research. And it's an extremely valuable resource simply because it's organized and set forth in steps so that you can understand step by step how to do the research and how to find the records. There's an America's Great Migrations project at the University of Washington, and it is another source for all of the different kinds of migration histories, but the Black migration is their main focus. The National Archives also has a section on researching in the National Archives with regards to the Great Migration from 1910 to 1970. And so if you go to the US National Archives, there's this informational page that will help you get oriented to what was going on and all of the major issues and the records that are available from the National Archives. The Digital Public Library of America, many of you may not be aware of this particular website. This is relatively new. It's been around for about 8 or 9 years, and it is a compilation. It's a free website that has as its goal of collecting all of the digital information that is available for free in the United States. And the number of records here has been growing rapidly and continually over time. And here you can see that they have another set of records about the Great Migration, which might be helpful. If you talk to your relatives, and if you're doing oral histories back into the Great Migration, and there are still some people obviously alive who would be, who perhaps were children or related, had relatives that were involved. But please be aware of privacy issues. There are some cultural and privacy things that you need to be aware of, and that it would be quite awkward to get involved with offending people simply because you are not aware of what's going on around you as far as the cultural context. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Appreciate the opportunity. This is a kind of a heavy subject, but there's a lot of resources, and it may be something that you were not fully aware of, and hopefully will be helpful to others as they watch the video as it's put up online. Okay, we got any questions or anything today? Couple of nice comments. Anything else? Okay, well, I guess we're through then.
Thank you so much, James Tanner, for that wonderful webinar. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope you will join us for our next webinar. I just forgot me to share my screen. Our next webinar, which will be on November 10th, watch out for the 6 dangerous DNA myths, part 2 with James Baker, which will be, yes, at the same time. And then a recording of this webinar will be made available next week, and you can view that on our YouTube channel or our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.